I'm Alex Hardy. He's Nick Ferguson. We are those guys, and we hope to be your guys talking the latest around the National Football League and Nick Ferguson. We've been teasing this pretty much since we started the show. We've got a wild NFL free agency, well, a tampering period that's going on as we speak. However, this is going to be what we've dubbed the Russell Wilson episode. Nick, your emotions, this has been months in the making.
Well, no emotions because I'm really not that much invested because I'm not playing. But just from an outside view looking in, I think it works best for both the Broncos and Russell Wilson because let's be totally honest. If we want to go all the way back to the very beginning, and we'll get to the Sean Payton part, but let's just talk about the kind of marriage that the Broncos were trying to form with Nathaniel Hackett and Russell Wilson. To be fair, Russell Wilson was plan B. Aaron Rodgers was plan A. That's why they went after Nathaniel Hackett. They pressed that button really hard, and then it seemed as though there was another team kind of creeping into the mix, and that's when the Broncos decided to make sure that Nathaniel Hackett didn't leave Denver, Colorado without a deal. Now, Nathaniel Hackett, I met him. He is a great person. I see you rocking that Star Wars Grogu hat.
That's right.
He's a diehard Star Wars fan. He is.
All right.
Yes, he's a great guy. But the only thing was he just kind of fell apart from the head coaching standpoint because he was trying to coach an offense that was pretty much built for that of Aaron Rodgers. And we know both Aaron Rodgers and Russell Wilson are two entirely different players. And they spent that entire time trying to get on the same page, but they never were able to make it happen. So you look at the Broncos, you look at Russell Wilson's statistical record, from a stat standpoint, wasn't that great. The team went 5-11. And now let's get to Sean Payton. Sean comes in, and the idea by ownership, well, they needed to make a huge splash. They did not ink a deal with Coach Harbaugh, who, oddly enough, finds himself with the Chargers, which is going to present a whole lot of issues for the Broncos moving forward.
At least twice a year.
Yeah. So everyone knew coming in that Sean Payton wasn't a huge fan of Russell, even though he did the campaign and the circuit saying, yes, he's my guy. He even told Trey Wingo that, yes, he's going to make it happen, but it was anything but. And I think for Broncos country, for the most part, it was rather disappointing because we knew what Russell could do as a quarterback, and we knew the resume that Sean was coming in with. But when you don't have a high affinity for someone and they play quarterback, it makes it really difficult on everyone.
So to fast forward, Russell Wilson leading the Denver Broncos probably made sense at the top to mention he signed a 1-year league minimum deal with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And because of how his contract works, the release by the Broncos will technically be June 1st, and they're going to spread out that cap hit, eating $38 million this year and close to $50 million for the 2025 season. So the Denver Broncos face themselves in a rebuild, and I'm excited to get to the Pittsburgh Steelers aspect of this. But because I have you, Nick Ferguson, former Denver Bronco, remains in that area covering the team, you know, the fit of Russell Wilson was doomed from the start, as you said, but then certainly adding Sean Payton into the mix. Now, I'm not here to debate, is Russell Wilson or Ricky Williams or Herschel Walker the worst trade in NFL history? Like, that gotcha stuff is not really what we're here for.
Yeah.
I'd still contend it was Herschel Walker, at least until we see the Pittsburgh Steelers win 3 Super Bowls with Russ. Anyway, I think that for a team that's looking to rebuild, you gave up multiple first-round picks and players to acquire Russell Wilson, and you gave up a second-round pick in addition to more assets for the head coach and Sean Payton. So for a roster that is now without a quarterback and a roster as a whole that's depleted because you talk about trying to massage that salary cap number to make room for Russell Wilson to play for somebody else, you have to let go of veteran guys. Justin Simmons, Lloyd Cushenberry, Jerry Jeudy was traded to the Cleveland Browns, contributors that could help this be a winning organization. So with less draft picks than what you started with less salary cap to work with than a number of the NFL teams, and with less talent on the roster as we're talking to each other right now. For a team that's completely aligned under the vision of Sean Payton, how do you dig yourself out of what perceives to be one of the biggest holes in the NFL?
Well, before I get into that, let's back up for a second.
Okay.
Somewhat of an idea that, hey, what's happening with Cushionberry, what happened with Judy, and what happened with Simmons are all kind of direct indicators of what took place with Russell's contract. And you can build it as that being the case, but when you look at last season and how things were shaping out, once again, everything goes back to fit. And the team tried to, as it said, try to get Justin Simmons to kind of restructure his deal. But Justin saw the writing on the wall, and for a guy going into his 8th year and knowing as though he's never been to playoffs, he's not going to take less money to join or stay with a team that he knows that's not going to be as competitive. It's not going to be a playoff contender. So these are just kind of, I guess, things that happen according to the business of football. And to be totally honest, when we talk about quarterbacks and how much they get paid, when I did that, well, Russell wasn't really worth the money that they paid him. Once again, I mean, the market value is the market value. We can't change that as much as we want to as analysts and as fans of the game. So if you want one of those marquee quarterbacks and you don't want to hit the reset button with a young guy, that's the asking price. Now, moving forward, as far as what will the Broncos and Sean Payton do moving forward, it's going to be really difficult for them because the first thing I look in the division, Alex. I say, well, what teams are in your division? You're going to have to play twice a year.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't beat those teams in your division, we're not even talking about being a low seed in the 2024 playoffs. And knowing as though you still have Kansas City, Harbaugh just joined the Chargers in Los Angeles. They just added Gus Edwards as their running back. We still don't know what's going to happen with Austin Eckler. But once again, that's a huge, huge undertaking for the Broncos. And you already have Max Crosby, and the Raiders add Christian Wilkinson to that mix. That makes things that much more difficult. So the first thing the Broncos need to do is they need to figure out what they're doing with their quarterback situation. Is it going to be Jacoby Brissett? Is it going to be Sam Darnold? Either way you look at it, these are just bridge players that you're hoping that will buy you time to draft a young quarterback and develop him. But still, you got to worry about stopping the opposing teams in your division, and not to mention the rest of the AFC conference.
So, right, we're in that period where we're seeing teams spending money and players are flying off of shelves, and you're trying to determine whether or not, if you need a quarterback, you solve that with a veteran like the Atlanta Falcons did with Kirk Cousins. Meanwhile, the Broncos are just kind of sitting idly by. And the Kirk Cousins piece of it makes me think that Russell Wilson wanted to sign for a team right away. I don't know if there was an incentive or a motivation for him to get his deal done before free agency opened. Now, 32 teams other than your Denver Broncos can afford a $1.2 million salary, but was he motivated to get this deal wrapped up? And then we'll kind of transition into what this means for the Pittsburgh Steelers.
Well, yeah, of course, Russ had some options. He took that trip to the Giants. And from what I hear, there are a couple other teams that were interested. And how could you not? A guy who's going to be a Hall of Fame player, and you get him for table scraps. I mean, $1.2 million. I mean, you and I would love to have that. But for Russell Wilson, that is just a drop in the bucket. That's pocket change for him. So it works out great for him. And you're right. He wanted to start this process long before free agency kicked into full swing, because that domino everyone was waiting for was Kirk Cousins. What was going to happen with Cousins? Was he going to stay with the Vikings? Was he going to move on to the Atlanta Falcons, which he is now? So now that leaves the Vikings to say, well, what are you going to do with Justin Fields? Are you going to try to trade within your division to try to acquire a quarterback like Justin Fields? But Russ made the great decision. I mean, he went to an organization that is historically known for being player friendly, teams that have proven over the fact of saying, okay, from Chuck Noll to Mike Tomlin, and that organization has only had 3 head coaches in their time period, and they've done 2 things well. I mean, with 3 things, they've won a lot of games, but they also ran the ball, and they've also played great defense. So he's going to a team that's eerily similar, even though they're a little long in the tooth in Pittsburgh that play great defense. I mean, you have Cameron Haywood there. You got TJ Watts, Najee Harris, which Arthur Smith's going to run a lot of the ball. And they have some weapons that they can put around Russell Wilson. And I'm not going to say it's eerily similar, but man, it's close to what he had in those days with the Seattle Seahawks. So this is a great fit for Russ. But more importantly, it is a prove-it year for him. And I think the relationship between he and Mike Tomlin is going to make this a better fit than it was for Russell Wilson and Sean Payton.
I'm not going to pretend like I know Russell Wilson and his motivations, certainly at this point of his career. But you'd have to imagine the last 2 years in Denver were humbling. Part of the transaction of acquiring him was not just trading for him and not having another capable quarterback on the roster, but it was the contract extension that went on top of the 2 remaining years that he had. Not only did he want to be named quarterback, but he wanted to be cemented and theoretically in place for more than just the 2 existing years. Now, certainly, how those last 2 years went and getting cut before that contract extension kicked in has to be some sort of motivator for him to essentially what I'm asking for him is to buy in Pittsburgh, understanding what the Rooneys and Mike Tomlin under the last 15, nearly 20 years, how they've run this organization. He just needs to be one of the guys. And it seems the last 2 stops in Denver and certainly in Seattle, alienating himself from players in the Legion of Boom, and just sort of his mercurial personality. He's going to be great in terms of what he provides for the community of Pittsburgh, but you just don't want to see any special treatment, I think, with where he is at this point in his career. And I'm genuinely curious, and why I prefaced, does he sign in Pittsburgh because he's told he's going to be the starting quarterback for next year, or are we actually going to see him compete with, no arguments here, a worse quarterback in 2023 than he was in Kenny Pickett?
Well, the whole idea of Russ being a worse quarterback, I don't believe there's a lot of truth to that, even though that narrative's been put out there. Look at how limited he was as far as the creation of that offense, and he still was able to have 8 interceptions and 26 touchdowns. And maybe if things go a little different in that Patriots game, the Broncos find their way to win the next 2 games and send against the Chargers and also against the Raiders to find themselves in the playoffs. So Russ was a more than capable quarterback. Now, when I think about Arthur Smith, and see, that's where the rubber meets the road. See, when you acquire certain guys, when you draft them or you inherit guys, the game plan has to be real simple. How can you, as an offensive coordinator, not showcase your ability, but the ability of the person who is under center who's playing for you? We know that didn't happen for obvious reasons here in Denver because of Sean Payton feeling though Russ wasn't a fit for his offense. But when you think about Arthur Smith and the quarterbacks he's had, Marcus Mariota, he's had Desmond Ridder, he's had Ryan Tannehill. All 3 of those quarterbacks have a unique skill set that you typically don't see in Sean Payton's quarterback, and that's ability to make off-schedule plays. If you add that ability to make off-schedule plays at the quarterback position for the Pittsburgh Steelers, now that is eerily similar to another quarterback that most didn't think was really mobile in Ben Roethlisberger.
Here we go.
Those off-schedule plays was able to help keep the chains moving, but also keep the Pittsburgh Steelers involved in the game plan. I'll also add this. That Steelers teams last year was plus 11 in turnover differential. The Denver Broncos were plus 4. So you get a decent run game with a defense that can turn the ball over and turn it into points, and a quarterback that can make off-schedule plays. Then I'm not going to say let Russ cook. I'm just saying now you got someone who's in the kitchen. So all we need to do is light a flame and give them the right utensils. So this could be exactly what Russ actually needed. Think about the fan base that we're talking about.
Yeah.
The Steelers travel, right? And if Russ doesn't do well, that Steelers team, while they may not be Philly fans, they will let him know if he's not performing the way that they would like.
There's a level of expectation, and certainly the standard is what Mike Tomlin constantly says. And I appreciate throwing out touchdown to interception numbers and Sean Payton more or less sandbagging him because of quote unquote his offense. But I really just don't know if Russell Wilson's skills and his ability to extend plays, makes up for the fact that he was dead last in the NFL last year, completing balls over the middle of the field. And it was a perfect marriage with the Pittsburgh Steelers because with Deontay Johnson and George Pickens, they didn't throw the ball over the middle of the field. However, this Arthur Smith piece to it, where in Tennessee, Ryan Tannehill completed 12.5% of his passes over the middle of the field. You had in his tenure throughout the Falcons, Matt Ryan, Marcus Mariota, Desmond Ridder, all throwing the ball 12 to 15% of the time over the middle of the field. And Russell Wilson last year was 5.8% of his throws, as I mentioned, dead last in the NFL. I need to see it to believe it, that if this is an expectation and using that middle part of the field where there's a greater margin for success, but also a razor thin margin of error, if your passes aren't accurate, this is the staple of the Shanahan offense that now seems like 2/3 of the NFL seems to be following, are these quick hitting passes over the middle of the field. And Russell Wilson is waiting for plays to develop and looking for extending plays. And his deep ball still looks great, but there are these low percentage throws that may not show up in the touchdown to interception ratio, but the amount of drives that would stall out, or the number of sacks that he would take, which is an offensive stat, not a quarterback stat. But I need to see more in asking Russell Wilson to do something that throughout his NFL career, certainly last year, he either wasn't capable or refused to do himself. So how do you meld the Russell Wilson offense, which has not changed, compared to a modern NFL and Arthur Smith, who is certainly one that subscribes to throwing quick passes over the middle of the field and allegedly, which was hard to find, utilizing the skill set that his players have. We didn't really see that in Atlanta, but maybe things will be different in Pittsburgh. How does Russell Wilson fit into that?
Okay, here's this whole thing about, and I hear it all the time, and you just brought it up, this idea that Russell's not throwing over the middle of the field.
He wasn't.
When we start looking at those numbers, let's look at exactly why. Because when you look at the triangle of the offense, right, you start top and come down. You look at the explosive plays, the intermediate plays, and then we look at the short plays, the check down type plays.
Right.
Now, what I've seen in NFL, you don't have to throw 30 explosive plays to be effective in the league. All you have to do is look at Kansas City. Right. The idea is that you get the ball in the hands of your playmakers. And also, I'll say this: where are more of the defenders on any given time on a field?
That's what I mentioned. It's greater risk because of who's occupying that space. That's why we've seen smaller linebackers like Fred Warner and Bobby Wagner being all-pro level players.
Well, it's about being able to attack the perimeter of the defense, and that's where you have less defenders. So this is where you have to layer your routes, but also, I mean, to me, when we talk about over the middle throws, right, my biggest question is, well, what is our definition of those over middle throws? Because when I think about some of those over middle throws, I think about dig routes, right? And I also think about those cross country, those deep over routes. I mean, even though they hit the left side or the right side or outside of the hash, guess what? Those are over the middle throws. And I'll say this for Russell Wilson and other quarterbacks who've been put in that category, when you don't have a tight end that can attack the middle of the field, it makes it problematic. See, with Sean Payton, it was a little different from Drew Brees. Case in point, Brees didn't have a strong arm and he wasn't mobile. So his whole thing was he can't extend plays with his feet because he knew he couldn't, because he lacked that mobility. So it's all about getting the ball out of his hands and time and rhythm. But also add this to the whole idea of throwing over the middle. He had Jared Cook. He had, I think he had Jimmy Graham.
Yep, Jimmy Graham.
And then he had another tight end.
Wasn't Jeremy Shockey there early in his career?
Jeremy Shockey was there. So those are three tight ends that not only can get outside and run those sail routes, but all those guys can get down the middle of the field. If you look at the Broncos roster, when Hackett was here and last year under Sean Payton, who did they have? Lucas Kroll, Adam Trotman, Chris Manners, right? And they had Greg Dosich, who was injured. If Dosich was healthy, he was supposed to be that particular guy. So this whole idea of Russ not throwing over the middle of the field, you can't if you don't have that guy. I'll go back just a little to make a point. Will Dissly was with Russell in Seattle. He's not one of those guys that can stretch the middle of the field. Now, Russ did have Jimmy Graham after Jimmy Graham came from the New Orleans Saints.
That's right. That's right. Trade a first rounder.
That's right. But they still were not attacking down the middle of the field. They were attacking outside the hashes, right? But let's go outside the hashes, inside the numbers. That's where they were attacked. So the idea is that Russ cannot attack the middle of the field is not so much true because it comes down to scheme and the players that you have, but because the numbers don't indicate that Russ is great down between the numbers, the narrative has been pushed out there that he can't do it. That's not 100% true.
He hasn't done it. And you can miss me with the highlight reel that's coming up with, we're looking at first-term Obama era highlights for Russell Wilson, trying to tell me he'll be successful in 2024.
Man. Listen, if you're going to make that claim, let's just actually be realistic about
sure.
it. Now, does Russ have some limitation? Absolutely. But
right, that's why he's $1.2 million for the Steelers right now.
Well, listen, the idea of an offensive coordinator is that you take what you have and you make the most of it. The biggest mistake that offensive coordinators make, and there's so many that have made the mistake of, here is my system, I've run it for 14 plus years, I'm going to continue to run it this way. In the case of Sean Payton and Drew Brees, how long was Sean Payton with Drew Brees? A long, extensive period of time. But you think about how Drew Brees knew that playbook like the back of his hand. That's not the same for Russell. It's not the same. So we're not truly comparing apples to apples. And here is another little nugget for you. If you go back to 2006, I believe that was Drew Brees' first year under Sean Payton in the offense. You look at where that team finished, and you look at Drew Brees' numbers, knowing as though Drew Brees finished the entire season. Russ did not finish the entire season. And he still didn't have his offensive coordinator scheming plays for him like Drew Brees had. So that changes a lot of the situation. But Drew Brees, if I'm not mistaken, finished that year, I believe, with 28 touchdowns and maybe 6 interceptions. So in the first year in Sean Payton's offense, Russ wasn't too far off, as most people like to think. And his offensive coordinator was not scheming plays for him. So what are we really talking about?
So now we're going back to George W. Bush era statistics for Nick Ferguson to make his point.
We have to take an account of that. First year for one guy, first year for the other guy. That's the only way to make a fair comparison. That's it.
So when it comes to Sean Payton, the downfall, or at least minimum, the 2 years of Broncos football, is he ultimately responsible for this with this scenario of them rebuilding? What advice do you have for Sean Payton in terms of getting that roster in a better position? And more importantly, how long is his leash if they don't turn things around sooner than we would hope?
Well, his leash is very short, regardless of the genius association that individuals lay upon him based on his resume with Drew Brees in New Orleans. He's got a short leash. The thing that makes his time track fast forward, just hit the fast forward button, all you have to do is look in Kansas City. That has put his time stamp on every single head coach in the NFL, on all 31 teams, but more importantly, in the AFC. So knowing as though you're in that division, you're going to be constantly compared to Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. And oh, by the way, you were the head coach that finally defeated Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. But guess what? You no longer have a Justin Simmons. You no longer have a Russell Wilson. So he's going to be gauged and judged by what he can do against Kansas City, but in the AFC as a whole. So his biggest thing is finding a quarterback, having a plan, because the whole idea, he wanted his quarterback to run his system, and he wanted to put his blueprint all over this organization. He now has his opportunity. And the one thing I know about Broncos country, 8-9, yeah, I mean, everyone celebrated that. That was a far cry better than 5-11. But you were only 3 games better than Nathaniel Hackett, a guy who you said did the worst coaching job in NFL history. So now it's kind of put up or shut up for Sean Payton. And if he don't put up, then Broncos country is going to ask for him to shut up and move on. So tough shoes to fill, a lot of pressure for Sean Payton.
We'll get to Nick before we split, but I have one more question about the Broncos before we do wrap things up on those guys. You ever see Office Space, Nick?
Yes.
I'm wondering if George Payton, the general manager, is kind of looking around and people are asking him, so what is it you say you do here? Because this is Sean Payton's organization. You look at the man who engineered the Nathaniel Hackett signing as head coach, the trade for Russell Wilson, the extension for Russell Wilson. What is it? What is George Payton doing here at this point in time?
Well, you know what? George Payton is like a great point guard, right? And a great point guard in basketball, you just facilitate, right? You set people up, you dish, and you let them score. Right now, that is exactly what he's doing for Sean Payton. And when Sean Payton walked in here, I mean, everyone knew that, hey, listen, he's not going to walk in here and just get a massive amount of money to coach his Broncos team. He's a guy that wants a significant amount of power. Just look at how many former coaches or anyone who worked in the Saints organization are now members of the Broncos staff.
That's
Coaches, assistant coaches, to trainers, you name it. They may even have cooks in the kitchen who are from New Orleans. That shows the level of power that Sean Payton wields. Now, right now for George Payton, it's just like, hey, I'm going to do whatever I can to set you up. But also with the word being set up, you always wonder, and I've been asked this question a lot, if things don't go well, will George Payton be set up as the fall guy? And the answer to that question is yes, because on all 31 other teams, when things don't go well, no matter who was orchestrating things behind the curtain, like the great Wizard of Oz, that GM is the one guy who's going to have to deal with it. And take you back a couple of years really quickly.
Okay.
Doug Whaley, who used to work for the Buffalo Bills.
Yes.
Right? Similar thing kind of happened to him. He got the team through the draft, and right after the draft, they released it. And I'm not saying that that's kind of what's going to happen with George Payton, but everyone's watching. Broncos country is watching, and they're constantly asking that question. Who's going to take the fall for this? And you know just as well as I know, there's always a fall guy.
Appreciate that. So, Nick, before we split, we had the Oscars this past weekend, and I was curious. I feel every single year that we do this, I see less and less of the movies. So, Nick, before we split, would you consider yourself a movie guy? And if so, anything from this past Oscars cycle that, had you excited to go back to the movies?
Well, yeah, I am proclaim myself to be a movie guy, but some of the movies that the Academy watches, let's be totally honest, over the past 20 years, most people really don't watch them, right? Let's be totally
Is that yourself included?
Yeah, well, yes. Like sometimes there are movies that we see and others that we don't see. And then once they win an Academy Award, then we say, you know what? Let me see what I missed out on, because we all have our movies that we like. But I saw Barbie, and just to be totally transparent, when they first announced that Barbie was going to be a movie, I was like, there's no way this was going to work. I'm not going to see it. But I was suckered into it, and I really enjoyed it. It was something different than what I expected. And then Oppenheimer. Now, if you're going to watch this movie, make sure you take off a couple of days, because it's a long one. But those are the two movies that I was really excited about, and it was great to see that they did well at the Oscars.
If I told you I watched one of those movies in theaters without my wife, which one would you guess?
I would say it was Barbie.
I saw Barbie without my wife. That's a true story. He's Nick Ferguson. I'm Alex Hardy. We are those guys. We hope to be your guys right here on Ride the Wave Media. Make sure you follow and subscribe on YouTube. Listen on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. If you are interested in the Patriots Dynasty documentary, some Apple TV films were up for Oscars, but the Patriots Dynasty documentary, we are recapping every week. We're doing 2 episodes as Tom Brady rises and that New England team falls throughout their dynasty. Nick Ferguson was right there for the start of it. And then you can also keep it locked on this channel here for Ride the Wave Media, because we've got so much news to cover with free agent frenzy and the tampering period. We'll come back with you later this week to catch you up on all the biggest signings. I think we mentioned Kirk Cousins. We'll see what B and C level players that the Broncos and my Patriots settle on in free agency. So without anything else to say, what do you have for the people, Nick Ferguson?
Hey, don't take any wooden nickels.
Nickel. What?